Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Ori. I'm the Executive Director here at the Energy Policy Institute at UChicago. Thanks to all of you for joining us for what I suspect will be a very timely and engaging and interesting conversation. We're really thrilled to have with us tonight Tommy Beaudreau, who is currently a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Latham & Watkins. For those of you who don't know, Tommy served for 6 years in the Department of Interior in the Obama administration. He was, his first role, just to think about coming into this, was as the inaugural director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the part of Interior that manages all offshore drilling, leasing. And so Tommy actually took over in that role immediately after the agency was created in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon. So he was part of the team that came in and helped to restructure the agency after that incident and to kind of rethink offshore policy in the Obama administration. So a huge and now very timely first role there at Interior. He was then acting Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management and was, following that, was the Chief of Staff of the department. Just some of the things he worked on in his time at Interior. He made a whole host of policy changes. One, he was part of the team that imposed new safety requirements on offshore operators after the Deepwater Horizon. He was part of the team that developed the moratorium on new coal leasing on federal lands. And he was part of the team that worked on requiring companies to control methane emissions on federal lands for natural gas drilling. So if you've been following the news, a lot of these changes are back in the news again today in the last several months, in addition to the Trump administration just, I guess, earlier this month, releasing its vision for offshore development in the U.S., which would be kind of a return to the policies of the 1970s and 1980s, a very expansive look at offshore drilling. Here to moderate our conversation with Tommy is our very own Mark Templeton, who is the director of the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic at the law school. Mark himself, for those of you who don't know, I oftentimes forget to make this point in my introductions of Mark, has quite a bit of experience with this issue as well, having served as the executive director of the Office of Independent Trustees for the $20 billion Deepwater Horizon oil spill fund, the trust fund. He was also director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, where he led the state's efforts in energy, environmental protection, state parks, and water resources. So, and before I just turn it over to Mark to kick off the discussion with Tommy, let me say, I always hope that these things are going to be timely and relevant. I wish I could say that I knew it was going to be this timely, back when Mark reached out to me in July and said Tommy Beaudreau could potentially be available for a visit in January, but it has turned out to be an incredibly relevant and timely topic for discussion, so we're very lucky to have Tommy here with us and Mark to lead the discussion. So please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that introduction. Last spring, I was teaching a class in energy law for the first time, talking about issues related to extraction. And it seemed like in March and April, every day that I was teaching the class, I would have to check the news in advance to see what new rollback had been announced or had actually taken place. And now we are...
Yeah, it felt that way for me too.
And so we have now 9 more months into this, so basically the anniversary of the first year of the Trump administration, a year after your departure from the Department of the Interior. As Sam said, you were involved in so many different initiatives. The department itself, right, is a $12 billion department, more than 70,000 employees. So we could probably talk about any one of the topics for multiple hours itself, but we'll try to cover a fair number of topics and then be sure to leave time for questions from the audience toward the end. So I guess one of the first things I want to ask you about was your first role at the Department of the Interior, being the head of BOEM. Obviously, Deepwater Horizon kind of spurred the creation of BOEM, but can you say a little bit more about kind of the Obama's administration, Secretary Salazar's thinking related to the creation of BOEM, what problems you were trying to solve, and what the implications were?
Yes. So in April of 2010, I was a partner at a law firm sitting in my office on Pennsylvania Avenue, and I had a very different type of practice back then. I was focused on internal investigations, white-collar criminal work. I think one of the last big matters I worked on at that time was a Madoff-related matter, for a fund of fund that had invested in Madoff to get that steady 8% that went up in smoke. And when the oil spill happened, I remember, probably like many of you, sort of sitting, feeling very frustrated, angry, but also not knowing, what role I could play in doing anything about it. But I remember specifically thinking, here I am, like teaching my kids how to recycle, and you got to put stuff in bins, and then, you have an accident in the Gulf of Mexico that puts millions of barrels of oil into the ocean, and I was sort of frustrated about the whole thing. And I got called, my partner and I got called to, a few weeks later, to come into the administration to help deal with the problem, both to look at ways to raise standards and engage in a very ambitious reform agenda to try to make sure that an accident like that doesn't happen again, but also to look inwardly at federal oversight and the performance of the offshore regulator, at that time the Minerals Management Service, which had gone through a number of scandals prior to Deepwater Horizon. And so Minerals Management Service was an interesting agency. It was the product of a secretarial order in 1982 from James Watt, so it didn't have any statutory basis. It was completely administrative from the secretary at the time, which ended up having some advantage. It's the reason we could restructure the way we did. So there was advantages to that, but it was truly a one-stop shop and was designed to be that. So the Minerals Management Service had three big buckets of responsibilities. On the one hand, it was responsible for overseeing environmental reviews and leasing for the entire outer continental shelf, so federal waters from 3 miles offshore out to the EEZ for the entire US coast. It was also responsible for safety oversight, so responsible for inspections and the petroleum engineers who would review drilling plans, et cetera. And its other responsibility was collecting revenue from all of that activity, including onshore, from oil and gas and extractive activity onshore. And so there's different ways to do the calculations, but by a lot of measures, the Minerals Management Service was second only to the IRS in terms of collecting revenue for the federal government. And so after the spill had happened, there was a lot of reviews and investigations into the MMS and its performance and how its leadership and directors spent their time. And as you might expect, for an agency responsible for collecting $10 billion a year, there was a lot of attention paid to collecting that revenue, including from departmental leadership as well as Congress. And so you can imagine how directors spent their time. They actually were focused on that piece a lot more than the other responsibilities of the agency. And that piece, the revenue collection piece, was also the source for a number of scandals historically with the MMS prior to Deepwater Horizon. And so there were IG investigations and criminal prosecutions of MMS personnel who were literally in bed with industry, right? So very cozy. And after the oil spill, a lot of questions were being raised about the MMS, its performance, its independence, its competence, its integrity. And it turns out you have one coke and hooker scandal when people stop giving you the benefit of the doubt. And so that was part of why we were brought in was, one, to pursue this reform agenda I talked about, but also to do kind of a government turnaround and to really look hard at the MMS, how to turn the corner on the past, how to restore its credibility, how to regain the public trust and confidence, and how to make it work better. There were these conflicts within its mission. There was issues around management focus and intention, and the solution we came up with was to essentially, through a reorganization process that unfolded over about 15 months, and we were very analytical about, to break apart those functions and establish new agencies with much more specific, focused, and deconflicted missions. And then, as was discussed at the introduction, I became the director of one of those agencies, BOEM, which was responsible for environmental reviews and leasing, as well as trying to stand up in North America an offshore renewable energy program.
So there have been some discussions about reorganization by the Trump administration, maybe even bringing these entities back together.
The career staff calls it the DORG.
The DORG. So what do you think about the DORG possibility?
So the entire case for the reorganization was what I described. And here you are, there's this catastrophe, but it took that catastrophe to really get everyone's attention on the need for this fundamental restructuring of this long-established federal agency. And even under those circumstances, we had to make the case for it, right? You had to explain, okay, to the public, to Congress, but also to the career staff, and say, here's why we need to do this. We need to perform better, and we need to turn the corner on the past and get back on our feet and be able to do our jobs. And so there was an extremely compelling case for the reorganization. And frankly, putting politics aside, to undertake something like that and the disruption that comes with it, there needs to be a strong case for it. And so being asked tough questions about why we were putting the department and the oil and gas industry through this were totally legitimate, and they needed to be answered. So the question in my mind, again, without being political about it, the question in my mind to consider reversing that, given its genesis and the rationale for it in the first place, those questions should be asked. Like, what is the case for recombining the offshore leasing environmental review agency with the safety authority, the agency we established whose sole focus, their entire mission is to be, the tough but fair regulator who is credible and calls balls and strikes. So what's the case for doing that? I'll tell you, I haven't heard that case. I haven't heard industry make that case. In fact, the folks I talk with in industry are concerned about it because they understand the disruption, which I appreciate, having done a reorg myself. The last thing in the world I would do electively is something like that. And so I think on the programmatic operational side, those questions should be asked about how wise it is. And then the part that, to have a little bit of a political discussion, the part I really don't get if I were advising Secretary Zinke is the political risk you're taking on with something like that. Even with all of the reforms, even with industry, and industry deserves, the offshore industry deserves a lot of credit for looking inward itself and upping its performance after Deepwater Horizon. Nevertheless, the risks aren't zero. There's lots of different operators, lots of different circumstances out there. And so to take on the political risk that you can't control if there's an accident, no matter how big, it better not be another like Deepwater Horizon type accident, but if there is another incident, given the lack of a case for it and the lack of a benefit out of recombining the agencies, to assume that type of risk on yourself where if there is an incident, Secretary Zinke is going to be the guy who made things less safe by diluting the safety mission of BSEE, wouldn't be my advice, I'll put it that way.
Okay. One thing, I guess kind of related to that, It seems that the department is, though, making some changes to some of the safety regulations, or at least was proposing some changes to the safety regulations. I guess that maybe some of that was done when you were the chief of staff in terms of some of the final kind of pieces of the regulations. So, for example, adding a double set of ram shears, for example. So essentially redundant safety measures. So it seems like this administration does have some appetite to take on more risk in these ways.
Yeah, and again, to be fair, so the well control rule,
yes.
which you were referring to, which among other things established new standards, including double line shear rams for blowout preventers as kind of the last resort to arrest a well that they've lost control of. And that famously failed in the Deepwater Horizon incident. It included a number of safety measures and was really kind of the capstone to the reform agenda from the Obama administration post Deepwater Horizon. And there has been, and I think it's sitting with OMB OIRA right now, a proposal to modify some aspects of that rule. I'll say, to be fair, a new administration comes in, it's their job, and I'd argue their responsibility to look at regulation, and if there, again, is a case to be made that certain aspects of the regulation don't provide a substantial enough safety or environmental protection benefit to justify the cost, that's what they're there to do. They should do that. That said, some aspects of the rule, and again, it hasn't been put out for comment yet, but drafts of it have leaked and some people have seen them. There's some aspects of it that, again, I'm not sure if I were sitting and advising Secretary Zinke, I'd advise to take on, because I do think some parts of it are meaningful and they should think long and hard about some of the proposals that are being put out there. Mm-hmm. And hopefully they will through the comment process.
Mm-hmm. One thing we've heard a lot or read a lot about in the past few weeks is the Trump's administration's plan for opening up all sorts of lands for potential leasing. And maybe you can say a little bit about the Obama administration's kind of philosophy I know you weren't in the administration before Deepwater, but sort of pre-Deepwater Horizon, then what happened when you were there, so we can have some context for the Trump administration's proposals.
Yeah, so the offshore program, the way it works is there are these administrative planning areas that the MMS and now BOEM sort of designed, and that carve up the outer continental shelf into distinct planning areas, 27 of them or so. And decisions are made through this statutorily prescribed process under OXLA to decide which areas may be made available for leasing. And you'll hear a lot about, or you'll read about, the 5-year plan. Before I came into the administration, I thought only Bolsheviks did 5-year plans, but it turns out under OXLA we do too. And what the 5-year plan really is, when it comes down to it, is a schedule. It's like a schedule for potential lease sales. And you go through this Section 18 OXLA process to decide in what areas do you schedule over a 5-year period lease sales. And it's traditionally this winnowing process that starts bigger. There's an EIS that is completed in parallel, and then out comes this program of calendared lease sales. The Obama administration, I think, it was, there's no getting around the way in which Deepwater Horizon, across a number of issues, informed decisions about leasing. That said, there was this sort of counterweight around making available under the new standards potential development, including areas like the Arctic, so the Beaufort Sea and Chukchi Sea, and consideration of other places like the Atlantic. At the end of the day, in the final 5-year program that the administration put out before we left office, the focus of the leasing, and the world had changed too. I mean, you need to remember some of that the shale revolution happened. There was a lot more, the significance of offshore oil and gas, even during, the 8 years of the Obama administration had diminished as a percentage of the domestic energy mix. And so by the time we left office, the focus was on areas that, one, had substantial and well understood resource potential. So the Gulf of Mexico, it's one of the most prolific basins in the entire world.
Well mapped.
Well mapped, well understood, lots of seismic, this incredible infrastructure. There are 4,000 production platforms offshore in the Gulf of Mexico.
And all the miles of pipes and things like that.
Yeah, miles of pipes, this whole spaghetti network that nobody knows about on the seafloor in the Gulf of Mexico. And an entire industry that resides there. And so as difficult as it was, when Deepwater Horizon happened, there was an industry present to mobilize and it took 90 days to do it because some technology had to be built on the fly to cap the well, but the industry was there to do it.
And so you think in that case, industry really did help step up?
Yeah, there's no question about it. No question about it. And it informed decisions and thinking and consideration of what it would take to operate in other places where you didn't have that kind of infrastructure. And so in areas like the Atlantic, for example, when the Obama administration proposed leasing in the mid and South Atlantic, because we did do that, we put it out there to engage the public on, thinking concretely about what that would mean. That was one of the questions was, where's the infrastructure, including emergency response, that would support the activity? And so, so those were questions that were asked and discussed at that time and are being asked again. But in any program, including, while I was there in the Obama administration, that balance between making available areas that have resource and have the potential to produce with what it will take to actually do it. And so you look at the draft proposed program that the Trump administration issued a few weeks ago that purported to make available all except one planning area on the OCS and 90% of the OCS. I mean, for folks who have been involved in this program, my reaction was, okay, like that's like a press release, right? And there's a whole process that's going to actually decide what this ends up looking like, and in a way that happened more rapidly than even I expected. Although I did expect them to have to start, walking some of this back pretty quickly, to pull Florida off after a conversation between Zinke and Governor Scott sort of happened even more quickly than I thought would. But even that is, it raises issues, right? And so one area where, there should be some discussion about is the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, which abuts Florida and is generally pretty well understood to have resource potential. So areas that the industry actually would be interested in, not the Shumagon Basin south of the Aleutians off of Alaska. Is that still on? Is that off? What would that mean? Are things that are going to have to be sorted out through the program now. And so that's why after that conversation with Governor Scott, Zinke did get himself in a little bit of a bind where even the industry was like, wait, whoa, what did you do? Like, the Eastern Gulf, we want to talk about that. So there's a reason why, again, if I were there, I'd advise to stick with the process.
Right. So maybe just one follow-up question related to this is you're from Alaska, right? And so there was a lot of question in the Obama administration about leasing in the Arctic, where arguably offshore, you don't have the same infrastructure. I mean, you've got some of the infrastructure, obviously, in terms of the onshore. And obviously, Alaska's an area with tremendous natural beauty. So how do you, maybe as an Alaskan, how would you think about kind of balancing those questions?
Yeah.
And did you ever sort of go, oh, yeah, wow, this actually is something that I can relate to. Like, this is not an academic exercise for me.
No, and it wasn't, truly. So the whole reason I'm an Alaskan is in the late 70s, my dad got a job on the North Slope and moved our family to Alaska after the Trans-Alaska Pipeline came online. And it was a great job for a guy with a high school diploma and 2 tours in Vietnam, and he had this fantastic job working on the North Slope and the Prudhoe Bay field in those early days. At the same time, everything you said is true about Alaskans and their appreciation for nature and the outdoors. And so that, I don't know if tension's the right word, but that balance is always front of mind for folks who grow up in oil-producing regions like Alaska. And so looking at leasing offshore Alaska, especially in the Arctic areas like the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi. The fact is, the Beaufort, for example, is an established field. Like geologically speaking, it is an extension off of the Prudhoe Bay field. And just last year, there have been a number of discoveries onshore as well as offshore in state waters and some federal that have significant potential. That said, the operating environment in Alaska, especially as you head further west in places like the Chukchi Sea, is completely different. And the infrastructure that you have in other parts of the world isn't there. You have to bring it with you, as we saw with Shell's campaigns. The weather is challenging and unpredictable. And so it poses unique challenges to operate in that environment. And then there's the whole question, especially for some place like the Chukchi, if there is a discovery, how do you bring it to shore? How do you bring it to market? And what would be the risk and environmental impacts of all of that? And so, I personally feel, there are places in the, offshore in Alaska, in the Beaufort that, folks know how to operate in and have a lot of potential. For other places, I think that it's a tougher case, operating, economic, as well as environmental.
So kind of sticking with Alaska and oil for a second, there's lots of discussions about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, but one aspect of that was opening up ANWR, right? And so and that's, I think, in a sense, very real, or arguably very real, relative to what you've talked about being sort of this, you start really big and then you start to narrow when you're going through this process of planning for offshore leasing. So is there a possibility that the opening of ANWR actually might have more significance than some, what we hear a lot about, more about the offshore planning process?
Yeah. So I remember in debate class in 7th grade, the resolved, we should drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, pro and con. And because it was 7th grade in Alaska, there weren't that many people who wanted to take the con position. So this debate literally goes back to Anilka, 1982 in the early 80s. And so the area that we're really talking about, so the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is about 19.5 million acres total. And the area we're talking about is known as the 1002 area. It's section 1002 of Anilka. NGOs like to call it the coastal plain and that sort of thing, because 1002 sounds like a gas station. So
you're saying rhetoric matters?
yeah. People brand stuff. And so the 1002 area, under Anilka, was sort of identified as someplace that should be considered, potentially over time. And the debate has raged ever since then, and it was built right into the statute. And it had gone sort of so far as President Clinton's desk before to open it, and he, of course, vetoed it. And so when I was in the administration, that area, because it's a wildlife refuge, is managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And
Also under the Department of Interior.
yeah, so that was a decision that we made, which in a way just sort of formalized the status quo, which was to continue managing the entire refuge, including the 1002 area, as wilderness. And that didn't sit well in Alaska because of this ongoing debate. And so the legislation, because it was going to take an act of Congress either way to open the area up, the legislation that Senator Murkowski from Alaska was able to get into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to open the area was a major victory for her, and a major victory for this established political position in Alaska. What it ends up meaning, we'll see. The geology, you can make guesses about it and you can extrapolate, but there hasn't been any seismic activity done there to assess the geology. That would need to happen. Questions need to be asked about the economics of it relative to other opportunities. The legislation, mandates that the Interior Department conduct lease sales, 2 lease sales within 10 years. We'll see how all of that plays out. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, not discounting the significance of it at all, because it was a moment in this very long debate, whether there's actually drilling in the refuge or that part of the refuge and how extensive and what it means. I think there's a lot of open issues before that happens.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing we were talking about a little bit before this was how, at least in terms of some of these issues, there's a general consensus in Alaska. So maybe not everyone agrees with every last point, but back to your kind of 7th grade debate, the vast majority of the public generally supports ANWR or the offshore drilling in the Arctic or things like that. How did you, so to kind of raise the question up a level, how did you think about that when there may have been a local consensus on an issue, or maybe there's a local consensus in Louisiana on offshore, but then you have these competing concerns or national concerns or different national interests. So how would you kind of weigh the fact that maybe the locals kind of had it resolved, but you had to grapple with these other forces at work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's fundamental to especially a place like the Interior Department, but any place in the federal government where, and this is part of the internal balancing that happens, and different administrations strike the balance in a different way. I'll say, those local interests really are important, and there's something that has to be paid a lot of attention to. I mean, if just to take Alaska as an example, low oil price has major effects, economic effects that reverberate across the economy and across social services. And so, that's part of where the politics comes from, right? Is, it's a revenue issue, and it's a state that, is largely dependent on taxation of oil revenue to fund the government and a host of programs that do good things. And the state really struggles in an environment where either because production's off or price is off to fund those programs. And so you need to appreciate that, and you need to understand what's at stake. And so, that's why, a lot of residents of the North Slope, including Alaska Natives, while bearing the environmental risk associated with the activity, are very supportive of it because, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, Alaska Native Corporation, funds a lot of programs out of oil revenues on their lands, and there's revenue sharing among Alaska Native corporations from it as well. And so it is a mistake, and it's irresponsible not to, when you're in government, make the effort to try to understand that dynamic and understand the impacts that decision-making has on local communities. That said, you also have a broader responsibility. And these are American resources. They belong to all of the people. You're making decisions on that basis. And I think President Obama felt this, quite heavily. You have a responsibility looking out to the future too. And so that informed a lot of the discussion too of, hard things being hard. Sometimes you have to make those choices, again, looking forward and looking at, what's in the long run best interest, even though you appreciate and try to come up with ways to address local hardship as well.
And so how much of that was kind of process in terms of gathering information and coming to a decision versus, I'll say, politics, where you kind of, you know who got you there, and you're going to listen to what others have to say to make sure that you don't go completely off the rails. But at the end of the day, there's you got elected by a certain set of people, and therefore you've got to deliver to them.
Yeah.
Or which issues would you maybe have more of a political lens over versus a process kind of lens over?
Yeah, and that conversation, that comes up, right? And it came up a lot on decisions like that. It came up a lot in the monuments discussion. And anytime, again, in consideration of my role, as chief of staff, anytime someone made that argument to me that, oh, well, they're not going to like anything we do, so we should do this thing that, has this detrimental and unnecessary impact, because who cares? They're not our supporters.
They're not going to agree, so we might as well please our base or whatever.
Yeah. That that didn't sit well with me, and that's not what we were there to do, right? And so sometimes, you make decisions that aren't going to go over well locally, but you don't do it to, it was always my attitude, and certainly my boss's attitude, Secretary Jewell, that that wasn't an appropriate part of the calculus.
Mm-hmm. So Sam mentioned there were some rules related to oil and gas, such as the Methane Rule, and maybe you could say a little bit about that. And I was wondering, how much of that was driven from Interior versus motivations that are coming from EPA or other parts of the administration. So there's both kind of the smaller question, but the larger, you're chief of staff, you've got a lot of different interests at play in terms of other stakeholders in the government. How did you sort through those issues?
Constantly. So methane, for reasons that everyone in this room appreciates, I mean, it's a huge challenge. It's a climate issue. It's extremely potent greenhouse gas. It's also an infrastructure issue, and it's a regulatory issue. And it's one of those areas that, and this was extremely common across a lot of things, including hydraulic fracturing and other areas that in the federal coal program, where you inherited and were kind of in some ways stuck with a regulatory program and regime that was literally 30 or 40 years old and didn't align very well with the current technology, the current scale of operations, or the economics and opportunity that's out there. And so, among other things, methane's an extremely valuable commodity. And so looking at it, aside from the environmental issues and the greenhouse gas issues, as a matter of stewardship and responsibility to the American people in terms of fair return and protection of the resource that belongs to the American people.
So just the asset.
Just the asset. Right. It's an asset, right? And so to vent it or flare it, you're literally, burning up, your fellow citizens' entitlement. So it posed all of those challenges. And that said, heavy-handed regulation that inhibits, safe development or, causes mature fields like San Juan Basin to become economic is, something that needs to be thought long and hard about as well. And so the effort that went into things like the BLM's Methane Rule was enormous, and the amount of outreach and sitting across the table from operators to figure out, okay, what would be the effect of this and how would you handle it, and all of that was a lot of time was spent. A lot of time was spent, coordinating and talking with the EPA about jurisdictional issues and existing sources versus new sources and what they were looking forward to implementing. That said, going in the hard things are hard category, we did want to take the stance of if you don't perform as a good steward and provide protection for the American people in terms of this resource, you're not doing your job. And if the economics aren't such that it's in the operator's interest to develop the infrastructure, they'll make very clear-eyed economic calculations too. And so that weighed into was how do you set up, again, without going overboard, incentives to capture and if you can bring that stuff to market. So we tried to, consistent with our authorities, and while there's benefits from limiting emissions, we really tried to focus on our set of authorities, which were not wasting this resource.
Right, the asset protection piece of it. So shifting to coal for a moment, there was notably the secretarial order by Secretary Jewell, former Secretary Jewell, to put a moratorium on coal leasing. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened? And what and the thinking behind that the particular approach that was adopted, which now, there was the Trump executive order that then Secretary Zinke kind of lifted the moratorium on going forward with new leasing. But what was the thinking in terms of imposing the moratorium as an approach?
Yeah, and it's a great example of of this legacy program. So the federal coal administered by the BLM, the federal coal program regulations that govern leasing of coal on federal lands, especially the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, those were developed in 1978, so the late 70s. And the policy imperatives that existed in the late 70s were, around vulnerability to energy shocks because of international events, and the real need to develop a domestic, stable, dependable resource for electricity generation, as the economy was expanding and trying to connect with rural communities and bring and expand electrification. And so, really important policy. We felt every, 30 or 40 years or so, you should take a step back and see if that reality is still the one you find yourself in, and whether, given where we are now, across multitude issues, climate among them, but also the energy mix and other types of issues, whether those held true anymore, or whether other considerations should be thought through in planning what the federal coal program for the future ought to look like. And so there was lots of input and lots of ideas about all of that. And the purpose behind the PEIS and the programmatic review was to challenge all of that thinking and all of that policy consideration and programmatic consideration into a methodical, formal process. There are different ways we could have done it. I don't think NEPA was necessarily perfect for it, but considering the time we had and the type of review we wanted, thought a programmatic EIS was the best way to go, and there was some historical precedent for it. And so then the question becomes, okay, you're doing this review. What do you do in the meantime? Truth be told, there was a lot of applications for new acreage and new coal leases that had been sitting with the BLM, and frankly, for price reasons, operators were telling us, we actually don't need that coal right now. Don't act on the application. And that wasn't the political environment, but that was the reality because of economics. And so the thinking was, on the one hand, new leasing for new tracts ought to be informed by and have the benefit of this analysis, so that all of those policy considerations that we talked about flow into those decisions on new leases. On the other hand, having done a moratorium before, following Deepwater Horizon, I also was very sensitive to the idea of, okay, you can't just impose a moratorium. You have to have off-ramps, and you have to be sensitive to special cases. And so for a host of legal as well as practical reasons, there were lots of exceptions to it. And so the moratorium itself didn't actually cut off any pending leases, and if there was a mine-to-mouth operation that needed new supply, that was specifically exempted. If there was pending applications where the NEPA had been completed and the operator wanted it, those would be followed through on. And so on the one hand, it didn't do that much, practically speaking. On the other hand, it was very powerful symbolism.
But it could have done a lot.
It could have done a lot.
You never got to the results. We actually won't ever know.
You won't ever know. If part of the direction was, we need to get this done pretty fast. so this isn't an open-ended moratorium before consequences like that start setting in. But like you said, it got lifted. We had a target for completing it within 2 years for exactly that reason. But it was preempted, and the moratorium was lifted. And so, there you have it. It was, in light of the election, it was like, it had a symbolic importance to the previous administration, and lifting it had a symbolic importance to the current administration in a way that is important to people and resonates with people, but we will never really know what the practical impacts of it would have been over the long term, the moratorium itself. That said, while the programmatic review is also not continuing, I do think there are things, because the coal markets have changed in a fundamental way. And so regardless of your point of view and what those policy levers ought to be, there are reforms and issues that the current administration should be looking at in federal coal.
Such as?
Does a leasing program designed in the late 70s, even if, your idea is you want to promote coal production, does that align very well with the new realities of an industry that has restructured itself and is, despite, whatever policy the Trump administration promotes, faces, realities around consumption and production. And so regardless of your bent in terms of policy, it's still a program that needs modernization. Mm-hmm. And so while they won't continue with like the programmatic review, I do think it is worthwhile, regardless of, again, one's political point of view, to look at this program and modernize the program.
Mm-hmm. Getting ready for our talk, I was kind of looking back at some of the events that happened in the Obama administration's Department of the Interior, and I noticed that right, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred April 20th of 2010. And then about a week later, Secretary Salazar approved Cape Wind. And I'm sure those two things were not at all related. So I guess I was just wondering.
I never really thought about it that way.
I don't know. You would know better than I would. But I was just wondering, as we're kind of coming towards the end of our conversation before opening it up, are there, obviously, renewables are increasing, the economics are getting better as they come to scale. You're seeing the phase out of various tax things, so they're really starting to compete. How did you see the role of the Department of Interior in terms of facilitating, promoting renewable energy, whether offshore wind or transmission corridors or kind of all of that? And what does that mean about what should the Trump administration be doing to promote these things, or at least not impede them?
Yeah. So I'm proud of a lot of the things we got done in the Obama administration, but right at the top of the list is offshore wind, which, when we came in, other than Cape Wind, which, had its troubles and really informed, in light of those troubles, informed the program that we designed within BOEM for leasing going forward, we were starting from scratch. And so, I talked a little bit about how I came into government. I didn't talk about why I stayed. I could have left after we did the reorganization and the standards, and we turned the corner on Deepwater Horizon. And that may have been my spouse's expectation that I would do that. But part of the reason why I stayed was specifically offshore wind and the opportunity in government, which is pretty rare, right? It's pretty rare in life, but let alone in government, to try to stand up a new industry and a new vision virtually from scratch. And now, as you described, there's lots of leases out there, states like Massachusetts and New York and Rhode Island, and New Jersey's gonna hopefully hurry up and they have some catching up to do. So you have all of this burgeoning stuff, and it's like, I think this year is going to be an enormous year for offshore wind, and seeing these projects come under PPAs and long-term contracts, which will lead to construction in the relatively near future. It's all it's on the cusp of happening, and it's extremely exciting. And it wasn't that long ago when there were these fundamental questions asked based on the Cape Wind experience of, oh my gosh, are we gonna, is this thing gonna happen? And there was enormous, and you forget now, but at that time, 2010 or so, there was enormous political liability at the Interior Department over it. It was the Interior Department, BOEM, my agencies, we were in the way, right? Because we couldn't get these leases out and all of that. And so I spent an enormous amount of my time, and it was a labor of love, on the offshore wind program to get these leases out, get them done in the right way, smart from the start, we called it, which was doubly clever because it rhymes and is alliterative. But in addition to that, it was really about deconfliction, right? So it was trying to take the lessons from Cape Wind, trying to design wind energy areas that had been vetted with stakeholders, states, fishermen, commercial vessels, environmental groups, Native American tribes, and deconflicted up front. So that when the leases came out, additional analysis will happen and more NEPA review and that sort of thing, but you try to, take the big issues and deal with them up front. And that's the program that we stood up, and now we've got, lots of leases and competitive program, and they're in the hands of operators on the East Coast that have the wherewithal to build them. And you've got states who are driving programs to promote offtake and do their part, really, and it is a critical part to make it a reality as well. So the renewable energy side, it's, again, people's memories are short, but just in the span of, the 8 years in the Obama administration on offshore wind, and then onshore, standing up solar and wind on public lands, tremendous progress. And the transmission piece that you mentioned is a huge part of the puzzle and a really difficult one. But that's one of the challenges of renewable energy, right? Is, take where the sun shines and blows and put it where, Southern California and other places where people need it. And transmission is critical, but it's really challenging as well from a permitting perspective. And that's frankly, one of the upsides I see for the current administration and its emphasis on infrastructure across the board. More infrastructure done right, with appropriate consideration for impacts and appropriate planning. This country needs it, and that includes transmission. So in terms of the current administration and its outlook on renewables, on offshore wind, the Interior Department and Secretary Zinke and the program has been humming along. And they seem completely supportive and behind it. There's been some funky statements out there about solar, and so we'll see how that goes, and then obviously the tariff issues.
Right.
And so each of these industries, I think, are being thought about in slightly different ways. But the mantra, which was our mantra, of all of the above, seems to be there. I mean, we got accused of like all of the above and none of the below, which was never really true. But that was certainly the stereotype. I think there's, and again, we could have policy discussions, and there's certainly plenty, that I'm critical of. But I think given the administration, the benefit of the doubt on renewables is warranted.
Okay, great. So I'd love to take some questions for the audience here. Yes, Tom.
In both of the examples of the methane capture rule and
Oh, do you have a mic? Yep. Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks. In both of the examples of the methane capture rule and the temporary moratorium on coal leasing, was there any internal discussion about whether a price instrument might have made more sense than capping?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was, it's a great question, and it's fundamental, right? And I think it's a fundamental insight into not all of the regulation, but some of the regulation, where there are other mechanisms. If you're concerned about certain things, including greenhouse gas emissions and climate, there's no doubt that there's other more direct and effective mechanisms. From an analytical standpoint, social cost of carbon and understanding what that is so that it can inform decision making. And then, the most rational thing in the world, and I appreciate that I'm in Chicago saying this, is, a carbon tax. And, the fact is, if done the right way, it is, it's the most rational thing, and that's why a lot of businesses support it. But that wasn't in the cards. And we definitely had an administration that was very concerned about and focused on climate change and its impacts. And there certainly was a lot of conversation about, on the one hand, what were the tools and levers that actually were available to us, as imperfect as they may be. And on the other hand, a lot of conversation about how the authorities lined up with that, and what's defensible and what's an appropriate use of those authorities. But there's no question that, in a perfect world, there's much more direct and effective ways to get at some of these issues.
So did you look at an environmental adder for coal from federal lands?
That was specifically something, and again, that was the whole idea with the programmatic EIS, was to create a formal process for vetting ideas like that. And so, yes, of course, lots of conversations around incentives within the federal coal program, whether it's an adder, whether it's adjusting the royalty rate, whether it's
Sure.
affecting bonus bid amounts, lots of those ideas, all of which some are programmatic and some were modernizing and some were ways to try to get at this externality that strong arguments could be made needed to be addressed. And so that said, lots of good ideas. They required some analysis and some vetting, and so that was the idea with the programmatic, was to put that into a process where it could be really analyzed and those judgments could be made. And frankly, why, again, from a values neutral standpoint, I think there'd be benefit to completing that type of analysis.
Yep.
Um, So I kind of think we've come right up to this, but I'm curious to very directly ask you, if I think about energy development in the Trump administration and the promises or the goals that they outlined on the campaign of bringing back coal and making America energy dominant and these kinds of things, the first two big public things were the notice of proposed rulemaking and the whole process between DOE and FERC for the coal subsidization and
Right.
nuclear subsidization. And now this announcement of opening, as you said, 25 to 26 of the OCS planning areas. And what strikes me is that in both cases, the ability to actually implement the campaign policy goal seems to be largely absent. I mean, both those processes, you could have come up with ways to do it and probably achieved much more of the campaign goal than the way they did it, which in the NOPR case now is just completely flamed out. And in the offshore thing, there's a long process to go and everything else, but as you kind of touched on, Zinke, by arbitrarily pulling Florida off, has made their legal pathway at least somewhat perilous now.
And is arguably inconsistent with the
Right. It's,
pro-production standard.
right. And so that's, on one hand, I see okay, they've got these big ambitions, but they actually have no clue how to do it. And it's kind of ham-fisted, and it might not work. On the other hand, lifting the coal moratorium, I think you guys have touched on it a little bit, but it could be substantial. Markets are in one direction now for coal, but markets go up, markets change. It could be hugely substantial. And so I guess I still, in my own mind, haven't really made up. And I ask you, as a person who, spent 6 years really in the machinery of a lot of these policy issues, what do you think is going to happen? 4 years from now, are we going to be producing, lots more oil and gas and coal than we would have otherwise? Or do you think that the kind of the system that's in place, the bureaucracy, the federal regulatory process is potentially more challenging than they're going to be able to really, and it's just going to come down to markets and who knows?
Yeah. So I think, and again, you're pointing out sort of the mismatch between the rhetoric and, what you can actually affect through policy, especially policy on, public lands. How much can you really move the needle on all of this stuff, regardless what you want to do, and which direction you want to move the needle. And I agree. I think the rhetoric completely outstrips the ability through these policy levers to actually, make fundamental changes that they seem to be saying, are policy. And so, taking the offshore program as an example, they face some challenges, right? On the one hand, this energy dominance stuff, and there was a time where, I was in the room with, politicals from the current administration, and they had a hard time saying it without laughing, right? Like energy, it's so macho, but but they got used to it. Now it just rolls off the tongue. And I think part of the reason why the serious people who, are now in those positions, who have spent careers, on wonky policy issues, had a hard time uttering it, as an initial matter is, it sounded ridiculous to them because that's not realistic and that's not what it's all about. And yet it's become what it's, at least at a political and rhetorical level, what it's all about. And so that creates a little bit of a dynamic where, and I think the 5-year program and the draft proposed program is a stark example of it, where you do things to promote this energy dominance rhetoric that a consequence of which are, one, they're not really practical, and it's not really what's going to happen, and two, you set traps for yourself quite unnecessarily, right? And so, and it leads to some of the ham-fistedness and amateurishness and stepping on rakes that we've seen happen already. And so, my personal point of view is, if you are serious about creating opportunity, for example, for the offshore oil and gas industry, there are things that this administration could do. Willy-nilly opening areas that have no resource potential isn't going to do it. Willy-nilly taking areas off that do have resource potential isn't going to do it. I laughed to myself when at the BOEM public meeting in Annapolis, the Attorney General for Maryland shows up and says, the only thing that Florida has that Maryland doesn't is Mar-a-Lago. And it's like, well, that and oil, they're not going to drill off of Maryland. And so, so from an access standpoint, there's things that they could do that would be logical.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, they should consider, and again, so the Eastern Gulf is closed by congressional moratorium through June 2022. They should think hard about working with Congress on, what makes sense there, and whether that's buffers or whatever, to protect Florida's interests while providing access to, this part of the Gulf that it's not, necessarily the same as the Central Gulf of Mexico, but it's perspective and realistic, right? They should think about that. They should think about, the Beaufort Sea in Alaska. The Chukchi Sea, is anyone going to spend a dime in the Chukchi Sea anytime soon when in the global mix of opportunity that companies with the wherewithal to explore in the Chukchi Sea have available to them? I don't know. I mean, politically, you can make it available. We'll see if anyone shows up. So in terms of access, those are the conversations that they should really be having. If they want to be ornery about it, talk about Southern California. There's potential there. If you want to wade into that, at least from a pro-production standpoint, it's geologically supported. But if you really want to make a difference, rather than these splashy announcements about making 90% of the OCS available as if the resource is evenly distributed, you should think about, again, this theme of modernization and reform. If you are serious about opening, for example, the Atlantic to exploration, does making that area available in the same way you do the Gulf of Mexico in 3x3 lease blocks, does that make sense? Or should you think about exploration units and that sort of thing? And so there are things that if they were serious and they had the capacity and weren't distracting themselves with reorgs and that sort of thing, if they were serious and wanted to push that type of agenda, there are things they could do, which would promote the rhetoric, but actually, are hard work and, it takes time to figure out and, that sort of thing. And on coal, again, the moratorium, lifting the moratorium, in a way, it was like a gift, right? It was like a very easy thing to do. You wiped it out, like, we gave it to them. But, there are things that they could, and it takes hard work and, that sort of stuff and process. But there's things that they could do in the Powder River Basin that aren't going to transform the fundamental economics in the direction that coal is likely to be headed in terms of our energy mix, but are consistent with, in some ways, normalize the coal industry relative to the way other industries have to work in terms of leasing and access. And again, I don't advise Secretary Zinke, but if I did, it would be those types of things that I would be demanding of the staff to say, okay, we're in charge of the federal coal program. How do we make it work better, given what we think the policy goals of the administration are? And we haven't seen that much of that. And the deregulatory stuff, obviously that comes, that again, it's not, I think, as easy as some folks thought it would be. And it's hard to undo rules because you have to do a rule to undo a rule. But in a way, that's like low-hanging fruit. If they're really going to match the rhetoric, there's a lot more difficult things to do.
Liz?
Been too worried about the offshore drilling because the economics are so bad right now. Like, who in the world would try to build an offshore platform when the prices are low? We have a glut coming out of fracking essentially for free. But I don't know how the lease program works, and so maybe you can tell us, is there any advantage to companies buying leases and sitting on them, knowing that they wouldn't be producing for a decade or more, but they want them as spares? I don't know how the whole lease program is structured.
Yeah.
So is that a concern that we have, that there would be preemptive purchase of leases to lock in the rights, and then it's impossible to undo because now it's a contract?
So that, when the industry talks about, mostly through trade associations, talks about expanding access, that's kind of what they're talking about, right? They're talking about option value. So in some remote place that has no resource, like the Shumagon Basin off of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, no one's going to show up for that. But the mid and South Atlantic, where even though there hasn't been modern seismic acquired there hasn't been seismic activity permitted there for decades. Geologists do modeling, and they enhance the existing seismic, and they look at places like offshore Africa and develop models about what the plays might look like and that sort of thing. And so, no, it's 10 years. Right, so the maximum, so the option value is, once you acquire a lease, the maximum lease term is 10 years, but it doesn't renew itself. But again, in a new area, that comes relatively inexpensively.
But it seems like if it doesn't renew every 10 years, and there's no economic reason for drilling in a lot of these places in the next 10 years, then we'll say, right, 10 years later, we say no drilling, then the opening expires and it's done, right? It's not like someone's locked in the ability to drill for the next 100 years.
That's true. No, I mean, there is real option value. I mean, if oil goes to $140 a barrel again someday, and exploration's worth it. I mean, the fact is, people don't know this. In the 70s and 80s, there were more than 50 exploration wells drilled in the Atlantic, and there was a reason for that. And the program was different then. But if the energy mix looks different, or if we see $140 barrel in oil again, which is what the price was when they leased the Chuck GC, who knows?
Yes?
Who does the exploration in the Atlantic when there's no leases for the oil? You just mentioned there's moratoriums. Was that done by the government, or was that done by
No, that was done by companies under leases that existed in the 70s and 80s.
And who owns the knowledge of that? Those companies, or do they have to give it to the government?
They give it to the government, to my former agency.
So it becomes public
The well data itself is not public knowledge, but the data resides with the government.
And the government could make it public or something? Or?
So if you go to BOEM's website, it'll tell you what the results for each of those wells was, but you don't get specific sort of logging information or anything like that, just the overall result of what the well was, which in all of those cases was non-commercial.
What, on all these areas, is the government right now looking at doing geological surveys, or are you just, so you have empirical statements about how valuable the oil is on those?
Yeah, so the government itself doesn't, so for example, like a first step, which is a controversial one in the Atlantic, would be for seismic, acoustic energy to characterize the formation and the geology. That would be done by private contractors, permitted by the Interior Department and NOAA. We made a policy decision in the Obama administration not to permit that activity, presumably under the executive orders issued by the current administration that says we want that to move forward. Presumably, they'll look to do that.
And who would own that information?
The seismic company that acquires it, it's proprietary, it's commercial for them, so they sell it to industry. They have to give it to the government as part of a lease permit stipulation, so we can see it. But the data itself is proprietary, that the company, that's their business, they sell it to oil and gas companies.
And the government is not in the business of selling that information?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And treat it as proprietary because it's commercial.
Sorry, the lights are blinding me. I'm looking through other questions out there. Okay, right here, please, in the front.
When you look at regulation, there's regulatory certainty, low-cost regulation, and an even playing field. When you were in BOEM or in the government, how did you weigh those different options when looking at regulations, and how do you think industry sees them?
Yeah. So it depends a little bit on the regulation, right, and what the field is, and what your policy goals are with particular regulation. I think in general, industry values the certainty piece quite a bit, and taking methane as one example, you spend a lot of time talking about, okay, what do you currently do, and how would that square with this reg text, and what's appropriate to push you a little bit, and what are you really just creating a rule that you're able to comply with. And so those conversations happen. I will tell you on a lot of issues, including the methane issue, where industry and certain operators and certain locations have invested pretty heavily in methane capture or leak detection and increasing valves and all of that stuff. Just because the government's telling them you don't have to do it anymore, I think they're looking beyond these cycles, right? And want to get it. And I've had a lot of conversations with individual companies who are like, there's regulatory improvements that we think are beneficial and we'd like to see that, but there is a such thing as, not getting caught up in the ups and downs in the cycles, because it'll all come back, and we would like to be able to operate on a predictable basis, even if it pushes us a little bit. And so, from a government perspective, I think there's, while you try to be responsible, there's a lot more sort of policy push on that end. From an industry perspective, while there's harmful regulation that they'd like to see addressed, predictability, stability, certainty is most highly valued.
Do you think, as a follow-up, do you think there would be any industry backlash to basically the regulatory uncertainty that's coming through the recent?
Yeah, I know there is. And those aren't things people put in press releases, but those are some of the conversations that happen when you go into the White House or OMB or the Interior Department, and you say, you know what, this, for a bunch of reasons, including, we're okay with it, or uncertainty, or social license, they're like, don't get carried away here.
Or will different members of the same industry take different positions on some of these? Okay.
Yeah, and that's, that's.
Or at least behind closed doors.
Yeah,
API may be saying something, but.
Yeah, and, you shouldn't be naive either. Like, certain industry operators see competitive advantage in compliance with certain standards, right? Like, they have the wherewithal to meet certain standards that their competitors don't, and they think about, okay, is that regulation good? Because we have competitive advantage on it.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that you guys didn't talk about is offshore safety. I mean, you talked a little bit about the rules that they're repealing, but I guess a more fundamental question, again, you had such, you were there at such an incredible time. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that BP paid for the vast majority of the costs of the spill out of pocket. And that the financial responsibility.
We were lucky it was BP.
Right.
Well, and I'll
The
just say,
financial
it wasn't just Alpha. I
responsibility-
mean, they sold assets all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't like
But they financed it.
But they
Yeah,
weren't required
okay.
to do that. I mean, they could have paid up to the financial responsibility and liability limits and covered some of the and dealt with the lawsuits, but they paid way more out of pocket voluntarily than they probably technically had to. And they were upfront about it, that they said they were going to do that. And, who knows what the federal government could have come up with to try to coerce them to do it. But the structure of financial responsibility and liability limits in the OCS at the time were, I think they only had to pay up to $75 million.
Right.
And now the Obama administration increased that a little bit, but it's only up to whatever it is, $100 million or something. And so I guess two questions. One is, I don't think anything's ever changed with that. Did you guys ever consider, instead of dealing with liability limits at those very low levels, for a spill whose cleanup costs went into the tens of billions of dollars, like a sudden death rule, that if you have an accident like that, you're just never allowed to come back. I mean, I think, if I could be remembering incorrectly, but I think, other OECD countries that have OCS development have those kinds of things. Norway, I think, has one.
Yeah.
So that's one. Two, the industry now, when they talk about rolling all these things back, are saying, well, we learned Deepwater Horizon, we learned all these lessons. Now these rules are just punitive and they're too prescriptive, they're technology forcing or whatever. And I guess just your kind of gut assessment, like, do you think do you think the industry operates in a fundamentally safer way today than it did then? And do you think that the rules are necessary to keep that? Or do you think that that was a fluke, or that there have been some series of learnings that are more fundamental?
Right. Sort of going to the open 90 limits and sort of your first question. Yeah, all of those things were talked about, and most of them would require legislation. And there were a number of legislative proposals that we worked on and worked with various folks, including especially Bingaman at the time, and it went nowhere. And the reason it went nowhere is every time a offshore safety-related measure was put forward in the Senate, it died over revenue sharing issues. And I did a lot of work with Mary Landrieu, and she was great in a lot of ways, but she made clear that there was not going to be an offshore bill come through the Senate Energy Committee that didn't have revenue sharing attached to it. So that didn't happen. And you're right. We did our best through administrative measures to, adjust the OPA 90 limits and that sort of thing, and catch up for inflation because they hadn't been adjusted since 1993. And so, we did that, but it comes nowhere near covering, the liability associated with a significant spill. And we were lucky it was BP. If it had been a smaller operator, the risk of walking away would have been completely different. And the fact is, and folks aren't, conscious of this, there is a wide range of operators in the Gulf of Mexico. And I, was surprised when I came into the job that, there's mom and pops out there, drilling and operating platforms. Not
Not an ultra.
Not an ultra, not, a Macondo type thing, but wells that nevertheless carry risk. And so going to your other question about, are these rigs necessary? Do you really even need a BSEE anymore? Industry has stepped up. I'll say, industry following the incident did step up, across the board, including, emergency response capacity and the Marine Well Containment Corporation to, respond to a subsea blowout more rapidly than 89 days. All of that stuff happened, and it still exists. I think the risk comes from the potential of moving into complacency, right? And so part of the overall risk when you get rid of the safety regulator is you've got rid of the safety regulator. You don't have that tone of vigilance. You don't have, a BSEE whose whole mission is to indoctrinate a culture of safety and maintain focus on that. And so you lose something. And that was really the story of, Deepwater Horizon in a lot of ways, and this lore that, there'd never been an incident in the offshore and all of this. Well, you come to find out there were a lot of near misses and that sort of thing. And then on the regs themselves, so again, it hasn't been formally proposed, but based on, drafts that have leaked, is it a wholesale dismantling of the safety regulation and well control rule? It's not that. But it does do some things that are troubling in terms of safety performance. So to take one example, if we have a little bit of time. So one example is this concept of drilling margin. And so what a drilling margin is when you're drilling an exploratory well is that ratio between what you have to put in the hole in the form of mud, drilling fluid, to keep hydrocarbons where they belong and not come up through the well. That ratio, that pressure you create with the drilling mud versus the integrity of the formation around it, right? So the fracture gradient. So if you put too much pressure in the hole, you can break the geology, and then you have the problem there too, because hydrocarbons can escape up through the formation. And so that margin, that ratio, is a very key aspect to a well design and maintaining control of a well. And so part of what the well control rule does is says you have to maintain a safe drilling margin, which generally is 0.5, but depending on operational conditions, you can deviate from that. Industry doesn't have a problem necessarily with 0.5 and with the standards and the way they work. The word that's being excised in the proposed rule is safe. You can see lawyers influencing that, saying, well, we can't promise it's safe, and that's not really our job. Our job's, to drill this well and maintain, a fracture gradient, and, you're attaching this aspiration to it that, shouldn't have regulatory force. And the whole point of that is, on the one hand, you will hear some industry operators say, you give us too much prescription. We want performance. So your standards should be performance-based. Well, especially in the context of drilling margin, that's what we want. We want safe performance, and that's why that word is there. And so the fact that part of the reconsideration of the well control rule is removing words like safe from drilling margin, or some of the adjectives attached to the performance of blowout preventers, including seal. They want to take the word seal out. Like, blowout preventers, hopefully seal, but really all we're responsible for is the shear rams activating. That's all we have control over. Whether it seals or not, that's up to God. And so again, what troubles me about that is, your point about, if you remove the expectation in the regulation and from the regulator of performance around things like safe drilling margin, performance of BOP around actually arresting the well by creating a seal, then you've let your foot off the gas, and you hope, responsible actors chastened by this massive liability that one of their peers experienced never backslide, but you take on the risk of complacency, especially in as complex an industry as the offshore oil and gas industry.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Tommy Beaudreau for being with us.